The definition of an MMO is any online video game in which a player interacts with a large number of other players. People have always teamed up to quest, raid, and PvP, join guilds and form friendships, and, sometimes lifetime friendships. So why is it now that after all this time and advancement in communication that we're having this influx of MMOs offering out a new solo experience? I think it's a number of different reasons, but above all sits convenience. I'm sure most of you watching this have had an occasion when you want to just go into a dungeon, so you queue up and it's just crickets. Ain't no one around, no one's doing the bits you want to do, so you think, oh, it's okay, I guess I'll just go level up for a bit, do some quests, pass the time, and oh boy does the time pass. 15 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe even an hour. You finally get in, one player's AFK, one's DC'd, and the others don't know what to do, and halfway through they'll say, I've got to take my dog on a walk. Both of them, they'll both say it at the same time, every single time. I mean, personally, when I didn't want to be in a dungeon, I would just
press and hold the clip and then pull the cable from the network port.
And then come back about 20 minutes later when they've kicked me, instead of just leaving. But clearly I've always just been this same socially awkward idiot. But imagine eliminating that problem forever. Well, there you go, follower dungeons. It's a way to experience the game without having to rely on other people. But the thing is, I'm not talking about low pop games. I'm talking about the likes of Final Fantasy and World of Warcraft. Both games now feature follower dungeons. And surely at that point, if you're considering doing follower stuff, should you not just consider playing a single player game? Maybe an MMO isn't for you? Well, personally, I think newer people getting the opportunity to learn a dungeon layout and mechanics before grouping with actual people really isn't that bad of an idea. Of course, a lot of us know what to expect when we pug a dungeon, and let's face it, depending on which game you're actually playing depends a lot on how well new people are treated. And of course, it can be demoralizing for some, especially if they decide they want to try out a tank role, for example, and then they just get chewed out by some arsehole whilst they're trying to learn. And let's be real here, one of the biggest reasons, as well as the convenience of it all, is toxicity. Whether you want to believe it's a problem or not, the fact is it is. MMOs just seem to attract more toxic players. Personally, it doesn't bother me. I've been playing them for all my life, but I can totally understand the concern from a newer player. You're there to enjoy yourself, not to get harassed by some kid because you aren't min-maxing a level 10 dungeon. But interestingly, it wasn't actually until EverQuest came along and made group content the norm. There was once other big MMOs that had a lot of soloable content, but of course after EverQuest came and did its thing, pretty much every other MMO continued that trend. Granted, there were a few other MMOs that came along a little bit later, such as Guild Wars, Dungeons and Dragons Online, Allods, and if you're Japanese specific, then there was Dragon's Dogma Online. It's an interesting topic that we've clearly been thinking about for a while. I found this article on The Escapist from 2007 talking about Dungeons and Dragons Online, which was supposedly the quintessential multiplayer game according to them, and the article asks what's the fascination with solo play in a multiplayer world. What I find is quite interesting is that why this guy is particularly opposed to the idea of it, he also answers his own question. He states that he solos a lot because he doesn't have a lot of time to play and his guild has collapsed to the point where he's the only member. Does that sound familiar? Because it sure as shit does to me. But that's exactly it, isn't it? It's time. Time is the one thing that at some point or another you're gonna have little of, and trying to balance a lot of other stuff alongside an MMO can be tricky. I don't think it's a particularly bad thing to want to enjoy the content that you're paying for, and if you get people being salty about it, well then they can just not play with you. In fact, most of the people that are complaining about the idea of these solo mechanics wouldn't be playing with these people anyway, because if you're using these, then you clearly aren't min-maxing your board city jumping loop. I've tried out a few MMOs with these NPC companion features, but before now I'd only really done it in Final Fantasy, so I decided to give the new WoW version a try, and honestly it's quite a nice addition. You can immediately queue right off the bat. I haven't played retail in so long I wouldn't really know what I was doing if I had joined a normal dungeon. The NPCs are actually not as bad as you'd expect the AI to be. It does have some issues here and there, but it's not like this. But they seem to break line of sight of enemy casters, and when I ran ahead to pull more, whilst the NPC tank wouldn't follow me once it had pulled, as soon as I actually brought the mobs back to the pack that it was currently killing, it did take aggro back off me relatively quick, and there was no point where I felt like I was going to die because the healing was just pretty good. Interestingly, I thought the dungeon runs I did were quite a bit quicker than Final Fantasies. That could just be me misremembering, and it's that or the fact that most of my gear is 400 plus item level. I also wanted to test out being a tank, and boy can I tell you, I'm glad that this isn't me in a dungeon group of actual people. I haven't properly tanked in WoW in, I'd want to say about a decade, and it shows. I'd most likely get kicked for this performance, and I wouldn't blame someone for kicking me. Honestly, I really wanted to push the NPCs to see how many mobs they could handle. For the most part, there was not really any issue. I was a little bit overzealous in thinking that maybe they would have a couple of seconds before they actually started attacking themselves. So obviously they got aggro quite a lot, especially when I was pulling bigger groups. But in one of my biggest pulls, we still managed to get through it with only 2 dead. And that's actually quite good. I've had more disastrous dungeon runs with people. But the biggest problem is it doesn't teach you how to play. It doesn't teach you your routes, what to pull, when to pull them. And these are just things that you'll only discover by doing your own research or joining player dungeons. But I still think it's a good entry point for people to start to get familiar with the endgame content. I do, however, have a little bit of a suspicion about this. And it's that maybe it's more of a way for the developers to cover themselves. And hear me out here, like, whilst I know that there are absolutely people who are out there that want to learn content and stuff before joining other people, they're able to do that, and that's good. But it could just be being used as a way to disguise the player drop-off. Let's face it, most developers don't even post their subscriber numbers anymore because of the negative backlash that they're going to get from stakeholders for publishing their own failings. Players who are going to be doing this as well, they're typically going to be on the mid to higher end of the game. Not necessarily end game or even cap level, but just close enough. And because the offer is there for a more instant queue, the player could be more likely to pick that option, meaning that they'll be too busy in the dungeon rather than considering what the population of game is really like, especially when they've been sat waiting for a pop as a tank for the last 15 minutes. And there are people who are saying that because of these things, they aren't resubscribing to the game because of it. Of course, this isn't going to be the majority of the population of the player base. In fact, I'd imagine the vast majority of people don't actually give a shit. But there's no doubt there are other people who haven't subscribed for the same reason. I do kind of think that maybe they're just looking for a way out anyway, because it does seem like a little bit of a weak argument to make that you don't want to play this game anymore that you've probably put hundreds of hours into just because other people are playing it differently to you. And you can probably tell, but honestly, I don't mind this idea. As I've said, I think it's good if you've had a long break from a character and you need to relearn before going into a proper dungeon, or, you know, just because you want to chill and do a dungeon and not have anyone care if you fuck up simply because you absolutely thought you had taken less of that medicated brownie than before, but it just so happened to be a bit sneaky and hit you different. So no, I don't think this is a feature that's going to kill an MMO, but what I do think is that some people might just have better experiences if they aren't playing an MMO. Now, I know for a lot of people, the reason that they play is solely for that social aspect. And of course, there's a lot of people in games like Final Fantasy that don't raid and don't do any dungeons. They're just there for the RP and glam, and that's fine. But if you also want that PvE aspect and the social aspects to it, I'd say there's much better games out there. I don't think this implementation is a bad thing. If it means that it gives somebody else the confidence to enter the more cutthroat world of endgame raiding in MMOs, then be my guest. Ultimately, who gives a fuck how you play? You pay for it. Play however you want. Just don't expect everyone to share that same sentiment.